I'm Ainee Lynnette Taylor with another episode of Dearly Departed Experiences of a Young Widow. This is a difficult topic for me because it focuses on the additional loss that comes with the death of my spouse. And that was the loss of his extended family, especially his children. When Frederic and I met, he had a 5-year-old son from a previous marriage and then grown daughters from another marriage. And the fact that my husband had such a love for his kids and the fact that the family was accepting of me made this such a blessing. And when you're in a blended family, so many dynamics can come to play. My husband being older, me being younger, me being African American, him being European, it could cause a lot of friction sometimes in families. But I truly felt like I was part of Frederic's extended family, even the ones that were overseas and didn't quite speak English well. We still had a way of communicating in a loving way that I felt a part of the family. His son, which was 5 years old when we met, was the absolute apple of his eye. For him to have a son and a namesake, for him was a blessing. He was so immensely proud of his 2 daughters, who went to college and graduated and forged their own path. And he would talk about how proud he was of his girls. And I loved seeing the children, his kids, interact with each other whenever they had the opportunity, since everyone lived in different areas and even his son lived in a different state. But when we were all together, and we enjoyed one another, whether on family trips or during holidays, it felt so much like a piece of me became whole. When his adult daughters got married and they had their own families, and I watched each and every one of his grandchildren be birthed into this world, it was an absolute wonderful thing for me to see them and watch those children grow up. Spending time with them and having an opportunity to see them, maybe not as much as we would have liked, but then to watch them grow up and then want to spend time with us. My entire existence was wrapped up on his side of the family. I wanted to make sure that my husband kept up with birthdays, anniversaries, special occasions, because I felt like it would mean so much. Coming from a family of divorce and not having that paternal parent in my life on a consistent basis, I always knew as a girl what it felt like to not have my father in the house and wanting to have that close relationship. That's what his girls wanted too. When the girls' mother divorced and they were on a pathway of feeling probably hurt and rejected, it spilled over into their adult lives, as it would. And there were times we had difficult conversations in family gatherings because of the fact the girls were still hurt about the divorce of their parent. But one of the things that I prayed to God about was that they would come together, that they wouldn't allow for their differences to split them apart, because if something happened to their father, and if their father died before they reconciled, truly reconciled, that the guilt would overpower them as well. Because they loved their dad and their father loved them dearly, I wanted to see them come together as a family, and I prayed about it. And it's amazing how sometimes we pray about something and it comes about in a form that you didn't expect. As I prayed for their togetherness and praying that they would become closer, Frederic had his first health scare. And when he had that health scare and he was in the hospital, his girls came to be by his side. And in those moments, I believe that was the beginning of the healing. They had a chance to talk and realize that life is too short and too precious to hold on to the past and to hold on to something that was definitely not going to change. And so while I always wondered, why did he get sick then? I realized that it was an opportunity for him and his children, especially his daughters, to come together and realize they really have so much in common. It was an opportunity for them to mend the fences that were broken from decades ago and for them to move forward. And from that moment, the first health scare until 4 years later, when he died, I believe they were the closest they had ever been to their father. And they learned a lot about him, and he learned a lot about them. And he enjoyed seeing his grandchildren and seeing them grow up and being interested in different things and even almost get ready for college. There were two that were very close at the time of his death that were in the process, and we were looking forward to them moving from high school on to higher education. And Frederic was so proud of them and so proud of how these young children, his grandchildren, felt very close to him, even when there was distance between us. So having that extended family when I didn't have children of my own, and then his son, who came to our home every summer and spent time with us. And I had the joy of watching him go from his young years to his adolescence, teenager to an adult, graduates in high school, all the way into the beginnings of college and into the workforce. I was very proud. I was very proud of him and felt like that I had some, maybe small part in how he turned out. And I also hope that he had compassion that most people don't see when there's a mixed family and a blended family. So when Frederic passed, we all held close to each other, like a family would do. We checked in, we made sure we were okay. We made plans. We made plans for what would be the internment in France and how that would all come about. But what we didn't plan for was how one incident would turn into the catalyst for the dissolution of our life. It's hard to talk about how emotions can play into families separating, and it happens a lot, more often than not. You try to hold on. You try to have that common bond even when blood is not there. Not being a blood relative meant I was still kind of an outsider. There was no connection, there were no children between us, so there was really no reason. But what turned things into a nightmare for us, his children, besides his death, was when paperwork that we thought, my husband and I, was together and clearly spelled out his wishes and thoughts and how he wanted his life insurance and pension and things like that to be spent. I found out that unfortunately his life insurance was not correctly in place. I say that only because I have no proof that the insurance was supposed to be given or turned over to his ex-spouse of his daughters. It looks like a mistake, a clerical one on top of that. And because of it, I had to reach out to his daughter's mother. And it was the first conversation I've ever had with her in the more than 20 years I was with Frederic. And in those conversations, she mentioned that, I'm sure that this is a mistake. He would never have wanted his life insurance to be in my name. And it definitely had to have been a mistake clerically because the documents were more than 30 years old. And it was when he first started working in North Carolina. And so I was like, yeah, it's not correct. But the life insurance and money will help out with his internment. It'll help get him to France because that's really important. And as I was told, well, you have the death certificate. If you just go ahead and put in the death certificate, I'll make sure that you'll receive the money so that he can be taken to France and buried among his family, like his mother especially. and everyone can be there because traveling overseas is not cheap. And I knew the process of getting him there was not easy. I'm willing to do it. I want to do it. And I told my husband when we drew up our wills and our power of attorney and healthcare power of attorney that I would do everything that he asked me to do in our wills and in the conversations that we had had. But it was going to be very difficult to do that financially. So I had to trust the process of believing his ex-spouse, who I had never had interactions with, because his daughters were grown. I didn't need to speak with her. But the ex-wife of his son, we had a better relationship because we wanted to make sure that her son in our care was always well taken care of. So our relationship was different. Needless to say, when I did my due diligence and prayed about it and asked God and said, God, if I do this, I am pretty sure I will never see a dime of this. And God said, go through the process, because if you don't, it will look like it was your fault, that there was no funds to get his family and him back to his final resting place in his home country. So I proceeded to do what was necessary. And of course, I did not see one dime of that life insurance money. And I had to figure out what to do. And that meant I would have to figure out financially how I could make that expensive trip and not go broke. And that became the beginning of our fractured relationship in the family. What I've learned is that when emotions are high and we're all experiencing grief in our own ways, it can turn into so many different things. It can be sadness, despair, anger, depression. It can be any of those things and more, but it turned into something as if we didn't know each other, as if I was the enemy at that point. When I said, I can't go because this is what my reality is now. I have a household to take care of on one income, and it was a 2-income household. But that was okay. I was going to do what I needed to do. There were sacrifices, and there's still sacrifices to this day. But what I wanted to do was respect and honor my husband. And that was what I was going to do under every cost. If I had to sell everything I owned just so I could get him back home, I was going to do it. But I could not do it when the pressures of his children meant to go at a time they felt was more convenient for them, which would have been financially inconvenient for me. And so I mentioned it's not what I want to do, but it's what needs to be done. And that fractured the relationship. There was some thoughts that I would not take him back home as he wished, and I said no. There were thoughts that I would secretly bury him in the United States, and I said no. And I always said, I want you all to be at his final interment so that we can then celebrate him and send him off properly. But then the conversations became nasty. And then I was harassed outside my home by people trying to deliver a legal document stating they wanted to take over the responsibility of interning my husband and leaving me out of the process altogether. When you're already hurting and already trying to cope with your everyday new life, when your partner is gone, when there's no one who's there inside your home at night, who's going to tell you it's okay, who's going to give you some sense of semblance of life or reason to keep living, it became very hurtful and I became very angry. I went from one spectrum to another and decided I will have to do what's necessary. I always knew he was going to have to be buried in his home country, and I was going to have to pay the full cost of it. But I could not go when his children insisted we go. And I mentioned death is not convenient. And while he was cremated, the convenience of having more time to make plans should have made this whole process easy, but it wasn't. I had to journal about my anger and the sadness of the betrayal because that's what I felt. I felt rejected, and I felt as if part of my life was a lie. The holidays and the niceties and the smiles and the dinners and the birthdays and the celebrations that we had, I was always reflecting on that, thinking, was that all a lie? All those years, that was a lie? That I meant nothing? And I could understand that Frederic's ex-wife of his daughters wouldn't care anything about me. She didn't know anything about me, but her daughters knew me. They knew how much I cared for them and cared for their children. Why would I stop just because their father was gone? But money became the catalyst for us separating and never talking to each other again. And then I was vilified in social media. I was accused of doing things that I didn't do. I was accused of faking my feelings, and that was beyond for me forgivable. So I had to really pray about that situation because I had never felt that level of betrayal in my life. And I felt as if this life I lived with their father was just the life I lived with their father, and they tolerated me. I always tried to do right by all of them, but it didn't matter. And so as I looked into how I could press forward, I thought about the word in the Bible, and God said to pray for your enemies. And I'm not saying pray a prayer of something that would be negative. It was truly to pray for all of them and pray that one day they would understand, that they would see the love that I always had, that never changed or wavered, even after their father passed. And even after I felt that I was left, rejected, and betrayed, I still wanted them to know I would pray for their happiness. I would pray for their children. I would pray that nothing would come of harm to them because of how they treated me. And that has been the hardest thing, is to forgive, because I didn't think I could, but I did. And I forgave them for all of the things that took place. And even now, as I sit here and have not spoken to them for now more than a year, and have reached out as an olive branch trying to mend that relationship that meant more to me than I think they ever could have imagined. It meant so much to have them in my life, the grandchildren, my husband's son. Those are the things that I constantly deal with. Because losing Frederic was one thing, but then dealing with losing the people closest connected to him was like death all over again. So as I reflected in my journal, and I wrote about places I could never go again because those were places Frederic and I would go, and then people I wouldn't see again, just like I wouldn't see him or talk to them or communicate with them. It was double the loss. I have learned that through prayer and forgiveness, that it wasn't going to sit on me and be a burden. Yes, I never saw a dime of the money. Even after I was told, yes, I'll send you at least some of the money. None of it came to this day. And yet God has kept me through every turn of my life that has really been some of the roughest places and times of my life I've never experienced before. And yet I've felt as if I'm okay. And that no matter how this situation turned out and how much they must have been hurting and how much I was hurting, I still would rather console them than lose them. But it happens, and I felt as if I needed to speak on this because it's important to do several things. Because the lesson I learned was I didn't check and double check. I didn't know what to check for, to be honest, to make sure that every I was dotted and T was crossed. And also, I learned the true meaning of what forgiveness is about. The forgiveness God talks about in the Bible. I've done horrible things in my life, and I say that as a believer now, but I was a non-believer then. And the things that I did, God could have persecuted me, but I asked for forgiveness, and He gave me forgiveness. So I had to do the same in this situation, and I have forgiven them wholeheartedly. And that has freed me so that I could heal. My prayer was never to be bitter, and that was one reason why I knew I was going to become bitter. It wasn't just the fact that I lost Frederic and losing everything that we had hoped to build in our future, but then to find myself in a situation where I had to scrape to get him home. But with the grace of God, I did. It wasn't the way I wanted it or wish it would have been. They did not show up. I told them, I invited them, and I tried to find a date that was a little bit convenient in the midst of the inconvenience of death, and they still chose not to come. But despite that, and I prayed about it, and I asked God to forgive me if there was anything I did in my grief that would have misinterpreted what they wanted to do for me. Whether it was the offer to pay for my ticket only if I could pay it back, or if I could give them half of his ashes so they could bury him. I don't know if I made the right decisions at every point and every turn, but I did pray about what Frederic would want and what he asked me to do. And that mission was accomplished. But what was lost was a relationship of the people that were the closest connected to him and would have at least given me a piece of him on this earth. And so when I lost Frederic, I lost his family, and that meant he was gone completely. Thanks for listening to this episode of Dearly Departed, Experiences of a Young Widow. I hope you'll join me next week. Until then, be good to yourself, and also forgive those. As the Lord's Prayer would say, forgive those that have trespassed against you. Just forgive yourself and know God loves you.